Welcome, everybody. I'm Graham Walker. We're coming to you live from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. I am joined here by our Senior Vice President, Mary Theroux. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to be with our friends around the country who care about what's happening to our society and who are concerned about some of the fallout of the current crisis, not just the health, but also the economic fallout. And I guess that's why we're here today.
And the fallout for liberty, yes.
And the fallout for liberty, indeed. So thank you, everybody who's joined us for this conversation. We really appreciate you being with us. You know, the coronavirus crisis threatens in some ways to morph into a kind of permanent pretext for big government. And by big government, what I mean is a government that's extensively controlling large swaths of economic and social life through bureaucratic supervision, legal mandates, and so forth. Essentially, the creation of a Leviathan state, you might say, could be an unintended and dreadful consequence of national reaction to this epidemic. And it happens that some years ago, and Mary Theroux can give us the details, the Independent Institute published this book by Robert Higgs, Crisis and Leviathan, which has proved to be pretty prophetic in foreseeing some of the fallout from crises of this type. Proved to be very timely. Its analysis seems applicable to the current situation. And we are getting all sorts of recognition and notice for this book, even though it's not a recent publication.
Right. So just to back up a little bit, so Crisis and Leviathan was actually originally David Theroux, who is the founder and president of Independent, helped produce the book with Robert Higgs, but it was originally published through Oxford University Press in 1987. And then Independent reissued it a few years ago in its 25th anniversary edition with a new foreword by its author, Robert Higgs. So Robert Higgs is an economic historian, and there were a lot of theories about how government grows. People obviously were recognizing the government had grown a lot.
I think there have been some estimates that for the century from 1900 to 2000, the government had grown like 6 times roughly in simple numeric terms.
Yeah. Right. So Bob started looking at it again as an economic historian from the late 19th century up to that point. And the sort of standard narrative was, well, society gets more complicated and problems arise and government has to step in and create new ways of dealing with the problems. But Bob looked at the actual episodes of growth throughout our modern...
Because it's very much a historical summary in its initial section. You're going to learn a lot about American history by looking at the details in here. So he shows that it starts back then, and it doesn't just happen in one smooth cycle.
Right. So you have kind of this upward trajectory of government growing on a sort of smooth cycle, and then a crisis will occur.
Right.
Usually there are war crises, World War I, World War II, certainly, but the Great Depression and so on. And then it will ratchet up very quickly and very steeply. So government seizes new powers. It promises we're going to exercise extraordinary powers in this time of crisis, and when the crisis is over, we'll give those up. Well, what happens is you get to the end of the crisis and it gives up a little bit of it, but you're never back down to where it started. And meanwhile, it restarts its growth from that higher trajectory. So it just keeps going higher and higher and higher.
Some of the key episodes for that phenomenon, I think, were especially World War I and responses to the Great Depression.
Right. Those were certainly, World War I was a watershed for America, because before that we had not accepted government going into any of these areas that it was allowed to do as part of World War I. And then that did set the precedent that was built on very quickly by Hoover and by FDR, especially for the Great Depression.
Yeah, and so I think we're going to come back to some of those details probably a little later in our conversation, but you mentioned, and Bob Higgs mentions in the book, this ratchet idea. It shifts up. So the shifts include things I think you mentioned to me before, Mary, things like fiscal changes, for example. Detail some of the ratchets up.
So Bob outlines three important ways the government changes in these periods of ratchet. So the first is fiscal. Yes, it gets larger, it spends more money, it adds new agencies and so on. And certainly that is important because it takes over more and more of our economy. But probably more important are the changes in institutions that this creates. So for example, when government took over extended sort of general welfare, it drove out very well functioning private institutions like mutual aid societies, with which people may not be familiar, but they were functioning extremely well as emergency unemployment insurance for people and other things. Once government comes into these areas, it drives out what had been well-functioning private institutions, and those are then gone. And many problems—
Or maybe severely weakened and can't quite ever get back up where they were.
They pretty much, most of them just go away completely. And then, for example, if government sort of drops the ball, those institutions are not there to pick it up again. So that's a huge problem.
So that's a change in social institutions. In other words, not just government spending, but the patterns of social life get shifted.
And not just social institutions, but private institutions as well will be changed. But probably the most important change is in how people think. So at the beginning of the crisis, we might think, oh, the government shouldn't be doing that. But of course, we're afraid. So we say, okay, well, just this once.
Yeah, just this once.
But by the end of it, we've gotten inured to it. Bob has some wonderful analogies here that, if somebody gets beaten every day, pretty soon they're used to being beaten and it doesn't seem as badly. Well, it's not quite that extreme, but in a way it is. We get used to the government being involved in these things and it becomes accepted.
Right.
And again, that then softens us up for the next round.
Yeah, it's the softening us up thing. It's sort of the normalizing of a new level of supervision, control, direction, somehow governmentally.
Spying,
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the spying is kind of ringing bells in my ear now. We're thinking about the coronavirus crisis. So how are we seeing this play out, this kind of phenomenon, do you think, Mary, in this coronavirus crisis, the kind of phenomena that Bob Higgs foresaw?
Well, Bob very rightly shows that fear is what drives the government being able to do all of these things. That gets us off edge, it makes us afraid, and we call out for government to do something. And certainly the corona crisis is absolutely a case study of that. We've had months and months and months of daily front page news, and it's really an unholy alliance between the government and media, because the old adage is, if it bleeds, it leads.
So in other words, it's in the interest of the media to have dramatic headlines, because then they get more business.
Get more people coming to read them, coming to watch them.
More clicks nowadays.
That's right. So it's very much in their interest, and it's very much in the government's interest, because it feeds Leviathan again. So this corona crisis, it's exactly what's happened. It's day after day after day, relentless stories, and a lot of misinformation. And the more sensational information is what makes better headlines. And of course, it makes better excuse for government
more
power.
Justification. And I suppose that if you are in a position of government trust, you're supposed to serve the common good, which of course we do want them to feel that way. But it's very hard to disentangle a person's commitment to the common good and their desire to preserve their own position in a bureaucracy. The more justification they have for their role, the better they feel about themselves and their role. The more their role grows, the more important they are, the better they feel.
And they're very risk averse. So a particular politician might be thinking, well, this seems a little extreme, but everybody else is doing it. So for example, these models that came out that shows these very extreme, huge death rates. And again, the media loved putting that. It's very sensational. It gets a lot of clicks. And then the politicians were using them to go out and do these press releases and showing these huge peaks, death rates, and so on, as justification for why the shutdowns would have to be done. And of course, once one politician shuts things down, the next one thinks, oh, if I don't do it, then I'm going to get blamed. So they're subject to all of the blame if they're wrong, but they don't get dinged if they're wrong, which they're wrong on this.
I was talking to one of our research fellows who's an economist recently, and he called this a bidding war amongst politicians to see who can be the most draconian.
Right, exactly. And they don't bear the costs of it.
Well, they might get reelected. They might benefit from having others bear the cost.
I mean, they don't bear the economic
No,
costs.
they don't bear the
So
economic
the
costs,
economic
right.
costs are borne by you and me, but of course we're diffused interests.
Right.
And they're fairly safe. And right now they're fairly safe in doing this. And it's our job to make them feel unsafe to do these kinds of things.
Exactly. That's why we're talking to one another and to our friends today, because we, people have different perspectives on the health aspect of it. I'm not an epidemiologist. We're not pretending to weigh on that. But what we can see, I think, and warn people about is the latent potential of the kind of crisis mentality that is built up around this thing, which can then end up morphing into justification and cause for extraordinarily extended government powers that people would not otherwise accept. And so sometimes war language is part of this. I mean, I think we're getting a little bit of that now. This is a war on the virus now.
Well, and again, you were talking about the Great Depression earlier, and FDR definitely used the war analogy when he came into office and started reinstituting all of these war agencies that had been created during World War I,
right,
and building on them, and again, using war language. And in the current Corona crisis, everybody's using, it's a war. We have to invoke these War Powers Acts. We have to have emergency powers and so on. The war on terror is certainly, before this, was kind of the granddaddy of them all. So yes.
And the Cold War.
The war on drugs, all of these things.
The war on poverty.
The war on poverty, which have all been huge drivers of, again, the size and scope of government. Yeah,
and they really have. And so we're seeing some examples of this now. I think people pick up on the rhetoric. I mean, when you say it's a war, by definition, wartime is extraordinary. Extraordinary measures are justified. One thing I do understand is the U.S. Constitution. I just brought my pocket copy with me. The U.S. Constitution has a whole careful structure of institutions and norms. It is understood in some elements of the Constitution, and certainly in its interpretation by the Supreme Court, that under extraordinary circumstances, Congress has passed legislation allowing for extraordinary measures which would otherwise be unconstitutional. Okay, so wartime is extraordinary. But once you start using the terminology of war more loosely, then suddenly everyone feels like, well, yeah, it's wartime. So this isn't really, if it's a war, it's a war. And so is this why we're seeing, I wonder, like COVID enforcement? There's this attempt to shut down gun sales. Where have we seen that? I guess
right of assembly and other things. Higgs talks again about the war constitution versus the peacetime constitution, and how the peacetime constitution has really gotten lost, has gotten completely lost in all of this. So yes, the First Amendment's under attack. You can't have a lawful assembly. Second Amendment.
Specifically on lawful assembly, I think you told me, didn't you, earlier, that in Raleigh, North Carolina, police were shutting down. What were they shutting?
No, they tweeted.
They tweeted.
The protest is not an essential activity.
Oh yeah, and only essential activities are allowed.
That's right.
So protest is a non-essential activity. So I guess in Lansing, Michigan, yesterday, they had that whole, did you see all the cars totally jamming the streets of the state capital of Michigan, protesting the measures that the governor has put in force there.
And there was to be one in Idaho today at 1 o'clock. I haven't seen the outcome, but I was getting alerts about it.
And of course, these aren't protests about, we want our favorite movies back. These are protests that are essentially expressions of civic participation. These are political engagement by citizens in a democracy. And yet even that is now being deemed non-essential.
These are people yearning to be free.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Emma Lazarus, right?
Yeah.
So wartime, the war rhetoric gives cover for this kind of extraordinary closure, and it's worrisome. In addition to which, wartime exigency justifies lots of other measures too, like we were talking about fiscal measures, the pork in the for special interests in some of these bills are you familiar with some of the details of those, Mary, where these
Well, they
bailouts?
very quickly passed the first three bailouts.
Right.
So the first one was emergency funding for fighting coronavirus, testing, and so on. The second was the one that Nancy Pelosi negotiated essentially herself, that provided for some unemployment benefits and other things. And then the big mama, the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, which carries.
What a lovely name.
Yeah, I know, they're so caring. It's like the Patriot Act.
Yes, exactly.
They're very good at acronyms in DC. But now during the negotiations around that act, to give some credit, there were very bad proposals that didn't make it.
Oh, thank goodness.
The proposal, it was originally, Nancy Pelosi tried to get into a lot of the aspects of the Green New Deal.
Like, what did carbon offsets have to do with overcoming coronavirus?
Exactly.
I really wondered that.
Again, it became an attempted Christmas tree.
Right.
That the voting reform that had already failed in Congress was in there.
She tried to get that into the bailout package?
Yes.
And she failed.
As well as permanently imposing requirements for paid time off on employers who are just,
employers can scarcely manage, right?
But they did manage to get in a lot of things that are unrelated to it. A lot of money for education, a lot of money for the post office, and other things. And now, of course, they're talking about, well, we need a fourth package. And the fourth package, she wants to put in repeal of the caps on state and local taxes.
Right.
Now,
what that benefits rich people in high tax states
like Nancy Pelosi's constituents.
We're here in California, and why do we want to benefit rich people in California as part of the bailout for Corona? I don't understand.
Well, I'm all for benefiting rich people in California. I'm all for benefiting producers everywhere.
Indeed.
But
the more they produce, the better
off we are. The cap on the state and local taxes.
Cap on the deductions.
On the deductions, it is explicitly, and I think appropriately, a good pressure on states to tax large amounts. And the proper response is to tax states and get them to roll back their taxes, not to resume limitless deductibility for it. And it does nothing, again, as you said, for the rank and file.
It does nothing for the rank and file. It actually creates weird incentives for states to tax more because the people can then deduct the taxes. And more relevant at the moment, it does nothing to solve the coronavirus crisis.
No, of course, no.
Yeah, and all of this, again, you're in this crisis situation, and everyone feels that you've got to take advantage of the crisis and do what you can do. Okay, so some people might say, Mary, aren't these kind of measures, or at least many of them, necessary to save us from this huge threat of the coronavirus? Isn't that what you have to do?
Well, okay, let's back up.
Okay.
Why do we have the corona crisis?
Right.
So just this week, Taiwan released the email that it sent to the WHO in December, passing along reports of atypical pneumonia deaths in Wuhan.
When was this?
In December.
In December. That's before we were even thinking about it.
Right. So the WHO declined to investigate and instead took Communist China information it was feeding it, which was disinformation.
You're not allowed to mention the fact that the Communist Party rules China, but you let the cat out of
the
you let the cat out of the bag.
I didn't see that in the rules.
It's a simple fact.
Whose rule was that?
Right.
Anyway, so there was that. And then, of course, the CDC has its very own intelligence agency, which many people probably do not know, which failed to provide intelligence that this was a problem. But we were in the enviable position of having several months advance notice.
Had the warnings been heeded.
Even without, we had the warnings. The news reports were coming out of the deaths in China and so on. So we knew there was a new
I remember
flu-like thing the virus out there that was killing people. And the CDC, instead of responding in saying, oh, quickly, let's look at, and all of the protocols had been released of the characteristics of the virus, as well as the tests that had been successfully developed by the private biotech sectors in South Korea.
That would have been the point, to let people go to town to develop the tests and so forth.
Yeah, the CDC decided it had developed its very own tests. It did not allow private companies to
Right.
develop tests. It spent months developing this test, which ultimately turned out not to be accurate
Right, exactly.
and cannot be produced in sufficient quantities.
So, I mean, you look at this whole picture, it seems that a whole series of government controls made us more vulnerable to the virus when it finally hit us.
That's right. We were not prepared, and we had lots of time to. We don't have to experience everything firsthand. We can learn from others
Right.
who were eagerly passing along
Right.
information of this is how we're successfully confronting the problem.
And some countries took the advance warning and they opened things up for the production of tests and other things more quickly than the US, right?
So South Korea, a private biotech company in South Korea developed a test in 3 weeks.
Wow.
They then released the formula to all of their biotech companies, and it immediately went into full production across the country. And within weeks, they were able to test hundreds of people a day with results within hours.
Wow.
And so they are pursuing, as are other successful countries, widespread testing of everybody.
And widespread production by various organizations, not just the government.
Right. No, it's all through private companies.
Yeah, I thought it was all through private companies.
So there are over 600 testing sites, including over 100 drive-through sites. You get the results within hours. If somebody tests positive, then they immediately do contact tracing.
Right.
So they
We're
go
talking South Korea or
South
Taiwan?
Korea.
Yeah, South Korea, right.
So they immediately go and tell the neighbors or coworkers or whatever, if you have a neighbor who tested, go to your nearest facility, get tested right away.
Right.
And then they'll get the result that afternoon.
And then
and they know whether or not they need to quarantine.
Yeah, right. And then they can self-quarantine.
And then meanwhile, the rank and file can go about their business. There are also apps that show where the hotspots are, so people can avoid going there and so on. So information.
But you know what's ironic about that? I mean, people are realizing now that in the United States, there wasn't enough test development and test production early on. So a common response to that is, oh, well, the government ought to get in there and make more test kits.
The reason there was not enough testing is because the government prevented it.
The government controlled the production of test kits. The
government said, we're going to create the test kit. We're going to have universal coverage of this, except it ended up being no coverage.
So that's the way it is when the government promises a universal provision of a good or a service. It sounds great, but then you actually get less of it.
Well, look at everything the government provides. It's rationed ultimately, or the quality is not what we're looking for. Education, they have a monopoly on. Well, luckily it's not a complete monopoly, but mostly, and it's very poor outcomes from it. The roads, we all complain. There's congestion. Well, not now, unfortunately. But we have congestion on the roads. The roads aren't being provided in the quantity and quality that we need, and so on and so forth. Everything that the government says it has to provide is not provided in sufficient quantity, much less quality, because we have no choice.
And so, again, I think this bears repeating for all of our friends here and others who are trying to make sense of this. Bears repeating in the sense that people say, okay, the US needs more tests, so the government should make more tests. But again, if the government had not kept its hands on the making of tests, we would have had more tests. So that the lesson from South Korea, probably Taiwan and elsewhere, is before the crisis hits, have less restrictive controls and allow more private organizations to develop and produce tests.
And it's not just tests, of course. There's a shortage of masks. There's a shortage of ventilators, shortage of hand sanitizer. All of these things were limited production by the government. The FDA and the CDC limited who could provide them, who could produce them. The interesting thing about this crisis is they've loosened those restrictions.
They finally had to.
They did. So now hundreds of companies are jumping in, everybody from Haynes to SpaceX are jumping in to produce sanitizer, masks, ventilators, and tests.
So in other words, when you need more stuff, especially more stuff related to this health crisis, you need the government to step back. In fact, step back earlier rather than later, because then you'll have more of it.
And I'd argue that these emergency limits on restrictions should be made permanent so that the next time we're prepared rather than having to catch up after the
Exactly.
fact.
Yeah. Like heading back toward the analysis that Robert Higgs gave us, and of course, it fits in because we're talking about the ways that kind of the ongoing sense of crisis had justified restrictions, which we've been forced to loosen a bit, following other countries' example to do better. You mentioned, as does he, that a crisis mentality and this kind of situation changes people's attitudes.
Right.
It really has an effect on their attitudes. So you mentioned, I think he does too, that the victors write the history.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So I was doing a little bit of looking in the book, and it's not on copy I got marked up here, looking back a little bit to try and benefit from Robert Higgs's historical perspective on the crisis phenomenon, going back to World War I. He recounts at length this really interesting section about Bernard Baruch, who had been, I think, a general and then a businessman, and he was put in charge of the War Industries Board, if I've got it right. And Baruch was very influential in the Great Depression period and in justifying some of the New Deal policies. And he looked back at World War I, and Robert Higgs notes that one of the war's most significant legacies was a heightened politicization of the nation's economic life. He says that some of these developments suggest that the most pregnant of all World War I's legacies was ideological change. The experience of war planning exerted a permanent influence on the thinking of economists and engineers. And so many of them looked at the whole world of trade and thought of it as being computed and registered in Washington with American resources on call. The faucets opened or closed according to the circumstances. And of course, these titans of industry and government leaders who were together in the war planning effort during World War I envisioned that their own hands would be on the faucet handles, of course. And so Baruch himself said that the War Industries Board had demonstrated, quote unquote, the effectiveness of industrial cooperation and the advantage of government planning and direction. That was the lesson that Bernard Baruch drew from World War I.
So again, as Bob points out, World War I was during the progressive era, and these ideas were starting to take hold.
Progressive era meaning experts should be deferred to and government should do stuff that the experts say.
So Wilson was a progressive, and he desperately wanted the United States to go into World War I and was successful in getting the United States into World War I, which prolonged the war and made it more deadly than it would have been otherwise, but that's another story and well worth reading.
Very much worth reading, yes.
But essentially what happened is Bernard Baruch was Wilson's, as you mentioned, primary advisor during the war. And at the end of the war was the driver of the narrative that the United States had won the war. Which is,
when you say driver, did he actually like get people to write about it, or
he literally hired people to write books after the war, again spreading this narrative that World War I had been won by the United States, that the United States entry into World War I had been key in its coming to an end, and establishing the groundwork. The government can do big things. It can tackle big problems. It can tackle a world war and solve it.
If we let government mobilize us, then everything will be successful.
So the segment you've read is an exposition on that of the government can do big things, and it was a huge shift in ideology in the United States. And as you point out, it utterly laid the ground for the Great Depression. Super Ratchet.
Now, we do have some more historical perspective right now, as you alluded to a moment ago. It's not at all clear that the U.S. entry into World War I somehow brought that war to an end sooner. In fact, it may have extended it. It's not at all clear that the mobilization carried out for the war effort did any good at all, either for our allies or for us. But the myth was created.
Yes.
Because there had been a crisis, and a crisis needed a myth, and the myth changed people's thinking. And the myth predisposed people when the next crisis came, which was the Great Depression, they reverted to the myth.
It was a very convenient narrative that was expanded on, especially FDR was masterful at expanding on it.
Right.
And he, again, people were afraid.
Mm-hmm.
There'd been this huge drop. There was huge unemployment.
Right.
There was huge uncertainty. FDR took full advantage of that, whether or not he thought he was doing what was right or not.
Yeah, he may have been well
was.
motivated, but that's not the point.
Exactly. So he established this myth. Again, people were crying for government to do something, which it had never done in a previous
Right.
recession.
Mhm.
Every previous depression had been sharp and short.
Yeah, exactly.
And by
not painless, but short.
Right, short. And we bounced back better than before. And Bob talks about the 1890s, which are a really good
Mhm.
example, but we won't go off there.
But we could. We're warning you, we could.
We could, yes. You never know where this conversation may go. But in the Great Depression, FDR starts unleashing all of his plans, the first 100 days and then the New Deal. And the New Deal wasn't just one thing. There were a series of New Deals, and then states, several states enacted their own New Deals. So you had this wave after wave after wave, which actually prolonged the Great Depression for more than a decade, and in fact, through World War II. But the narrative, after the fact, the narrative was established that the New Deal helped people. It softened the Great Depression.
And of course,
it put people back to work.
It helped people because it must have helped people because it said it was to help people.
Right, exactly. But we had, again, it was a period of great misery.
It really was. And prolonged unnecessarily. The real roots of the Great Depression have a lot more to do with destabilization of our currency and with the tariff policies that were in place. A lot of people say, oh, well, it was capitalism run amok that caused the Great Depression. It seems clear that it wasn't that.
Well, Bob's shown that it was uncertainty.
Yeah, uncertainty.
So they kept changing the rules. Again, it wasn't just one New Deal. Yeah. They established rules.
Business hates uncertainty.
And everybody knew, okay, these are the new rules of the game.
Right.
Business is very good at operating under a change in rules as long as they know, okay, these are the new rules. We can live with that.
Yeah.
And then
here's how we adapt.
They adapt.
Right.
But with the new deals, the rules kept changing.
Right.
And they kept, again, at the state level as well. So business just froze. Everything just froze.
We don't know
because
what's going to happen next.
What's going to happen tomorrow? They're going to change the rules again. And that is what prolonged it forever. And we saw it again in the Great Recession. So you had...
You mean 08 to 10 or so?
Yeah. So you had TARP and bailouts and quantitative easing. Again, Bob was still actively working then and showed there was lots of liquidity in the US economy, but it was frozen. All of these companies were sitting on huge piles of cash, but they were afraid to deploy it, to invest it, because the rules were constantly changing. There was great uncertainty. And human beings and businesses do not operate well in uncertainty. And that's really what's going on today. Nobody knows. How long are the lockdowns going to last? What are the preconditions for us coming out?
Like, Gavin, okay, let's just spell it out. What are the steps going to be so we know what to expect?
Exactly. And I think people would be a lot better. Businesses would be able to plan again. We're out of business, but we're going to be back in 5 days or whatever. Let's plan accordingly. But nobody knows. And then Gavin Newsom and other governors hold these press conferences saying, we're laying out plans to reopen the economy. But what they say are the prerequisites are so vague.
They were so vague.
It does not shine any light on, well, what are they? It's basically, it boils down to is, well, when I put my finger up and I decide,
when I say so,
it feels about right to me, then we will. And of course, when will it ever be right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it really is a kind of extended legacy of the thinking of the progressive era that not only justified the New Deal measures, but continues to be invoked over time, as Robert Higgs has pointed out, with various crises over the years, even affecting our thinking now. So probably the most progressive city in the United States is across the bay from us here, San Francisco, which is the city of my own ancestors for many generations. The thinking in San Francisco falls so quickly into this Leviathan-oriented habit. And you were telling me earlier about some of the San Francisco measures that are supposed to be distancing people and are not so successful.
Yeah, so San Francisco does pride itself on its progressivism
Mhm.
all the time. And I was just so struck by how that actually plays out in a time of crisis such as this. So I showed you this pictogram, and hopefully this will come through.
Yeah,
When I find
there
the
you go.
camera.
Okay, there it is.
So this is a shelter that the wise leaders of San Francisco City Hall designed to get the homeless off of the streets and into shelter. So this is San Francisco's Moscone Convention Center. They taped 6-foot squares on the floor, stuck rubber mats in the middle of them with a folding metal chair next to them.
Unbelievable.
So that shows you the thinking. They're thinking they're dealing with cogs.
Exactly.
That they can just put these cogs in the
Right.
middle of these squares and somehow they'll magically stay on the mat, because that's what the smart leaders know is good for them.
Right.
And they have absolutely no recognition that they're dealing with human beings.
Right.
And this to me is just a proxy for the thinking
Also.
of all of these progressive central planners. They think they're dealing with cogs and they can just,
Or they're programming microchips or something.
right. And they're alluding to the economy as something that can be switched off and then switched on.
And they think they have the switch.
Well, von Mises rightly pointed out that the economy is just human action.
Right. Right.
It's millions of individual humans with differing cares, preferences, susceptibilities to disease, situations, and so on. And these central planners want to apply a one-size-fits-all hammer, well, chain
Right.
to everybody.
One thing I really like about Bob Higgs's work here in Crisis and Leviathan is not only the detailed narrative about some of the stuff we were talking about, but the underlying understanding of what moves history forward. Bob Higgs is not a historicist, by which I mean he's not a historical determinist. He does not allow and does not see evidence for the idea that there's these big unitary forces in history that are impersonal. What really happens is human action.
Right.
And so none of these things is inevitable. In fact, going further back with Higgs, this is just like a side rabbit trail, but looking back at President Grover Cleveland, there was a period there when you mentioned earlier, I think we were threatened with economic difficulty. And instead of allowing it to ratchet governments roll up, Cleveland held on to the Constitution.
Yes.
And the result
was the economy recovered and we carried on bigger and better than before.
So in other words, even by Robert Higgs' own analysis, there isn't like this inevitable ratcheting up. It's,
right.
Nothing
the
is
ratchet
inevitable.
it's not physics. The
it's
ratchet is not physics.
Exactly.
It's completely driven again by ideology.
Yeah, what people believe is true. Yeah, which is why we're talking to one another today and to all our friends, because it really actually does make a difference what people think is true.
It makes all the difference.
It makes all the differences. So, is the ratchet effect inevitable, Mary? And so,
absolutely not. What's ratcheted us up can ratchet us down. If people shift their thinking and start to question these narratives, learn the history, understand that government is not making things better, they're making things worse. The power corrupts, and people have to be controlled in their use and their ability to use power. It can and will be reversed. And of course, that's what Independent Institute is here to do, is to spread information, to give people good examples of how markets provide better than the government.
Which just means people provide for one another better than the government. That's what that means.
We interacting voluntarily together.
We don't worship markets. We
take
just admire
better care
people.
of each other than these central planners who want to stick us in a 6-foot square.
So in the current situation, then, there are things that can be learned, actually. And Robert Higgs's analysis helps us to notice what the important things to learn are. It might be possible to ratchet down. We mentioned a little while ago, you gave us some details, how the US was in a weak and vulnerable position because the CDC had clamped down on testing.
Right.
So now,
and the FDA had controlled masks and ventilators
yeah.
and hand sanitizer.
So to ratchet that down, so what should we learn from that?
And make them permanent. Then there were also there are current temporary relaxations on doctors being able to practice across state lines.
Thank goodness.
On Medicare covering telemedicine and so on.
Right.
All of these things should be made permanent.
Exactly.
And then our needs will be much better, more fully met with a lot of choice. And then we need to extend those lessons into other areas of our lives as well. If the government is doing a lousy job of taking care of our health, maybe it's doing a lousy job of taking care of our security. Maybe it's doing a lousy job of taking care of our education.
Right.
And so on and so forth.
And let's learn from our situation. In other words, instead of just reverting back when it's over, the habit, it's a habit of mind that many Americans have developed, and sometimes it gets reinforced in the schools, including higher education. The habit of mind is there's a problem, government should solve it. Often what we're learning from this crisis in many respects is that government should keep as much out of the way as is feasible so that the problem can be solved, rather than by stepping in and trying to solve it, which will make it worse. And even though the motivation for doing so may be, allegedly a good one, like the reason that they were holding on to the test development, I guess they were trying to protect the public, protect consumers, but it made consumers worse and more vulnerable.
That's right.
And then there's another thing we're dealing with at the Independence Institute right now. California, before the pandemic situation hit, had established a piece of legislation called AB 5, which had to do with limiting what part-time independent contractors could do. It used to be that Californians were free, writers, artists, delivery people, and so many other gig workers could create a whole bucket of clientele for themselves and provide services. But under AB 5, now there's very draconian limits. You can scarcely hire anybody to do these services. Otherwise, you're going to be penalized by the state. But this has now rendered Californians in a position where just when we need delivery people and when people need to augment their incomes by doing what they can remotely on an independent contractor basis.
Well, and it also impacted independent contractor health
that too, yeah, exactly. It made them much more vulnerable.
Right. So again,
So tell them what we're doing about it.
Well, we wrote and have circulated and have 150 some signatures on an open letter to Gavin Newsom, the governor, and the legislature, asking them to roll it back. And certainly these circumstances hopefully will be a compelling reason they will recognize that it was a bad idea gone bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever.
I mean, under pandemic conditions, we realized that the AB 5 created restrictions that made everyone worse off and more vulnerable in the pandemic. Let's suspend the darn thing. And of course, we hope that ultimately we can ratchet it down and get rid of it.
Again, in human action, we need to leave individuals free to be able to interact with one another and help serve one another's needs, whether through commerce or through voluntary action or through forming associations and so on. So
there's reason for optimism here, on many levels. I see optimism in the sense that many of the epidemiology experts do see the thing kind of plateauing and eventually tapering down and so forth, literally in health terms. But also we're pointing out reason to be optimistic that American citizens can start realizing that, hey, it was a good thing to let doctors operate across state lines. We may be able to actually put America in a less vulnerable position by eliminating some of these government controls long term. So we do have questions from folks who have signed up for this broadcast, and Mary Theroux and I are looking at some of these questions here. Let's take a stab at some of these, Mary. Let's see. The first one, maybe we can talk a little bit about here. This was submitted by someone who's called himself Solver, which is a nice name for.
We like solvers.
We like solvers, exactly. So Solver says, what are some effective methods that individuals can use to regain their lost liberties from politicians who would use a crisis, such as the coronavirus pandemic, as an opportunity to extend their power to control others? What can individuals do?
Become informed.
Absolutely.
So good information is the best enemy of government power grabs. There are a lot of great sources for good, solid information that
Mhm.
refute the narrative that's being driven by this
Mhm.
unholy media government
media
alliance.
government. Mhm.
And we're in the very fortunate position currently of we do have a lot of sources of information
Mhm.
available.
Mhm.
Yes, that also means we have to shift
Yeah, there's a
through
lot of
the
chaff.
good versus the bad.
Right.
But one can fairly quickly establish what are the sources of good information, good, accurate information,
Mhm.
tested information,
Mhm.
versus what's just repeating unproven things. So, for example, if you're looking at people touting these models that show these
Mhm.
peaks,
Mhm.
well, take a look at the dates. These people were projecting peaks, and they claim now they're walking them back.
Right.
They're claiming that, oh, that was based on the assumption the government does nothing.
Mhm. So
Well,
yeah,
but,
we overprojected, but that's only because we assumed government would do nothing. But
their peaks, the predicted, in many cases, predate
Mhm.
when the shutdowns were done.
Mhm.
So are you saying that the government action somehow miraculously, retroactively
Mhm.
flatten the curve?
Mhm.
So things like that, and just and learning information such that you can engage in reasoned conversation with your friends. You can post
Yeah, reasoned
good
conversation,
information
right.
with people
Mhm.
in a friendly questions are a wonderful way
Mhm.
to dialogue with others, and just provide good information that
Mhm.
helps inform everybody. And again, good information is the enemy of bad power.
So, you can check out information that we provide. Of course, you can get a copy of Robert Higgs's book, which is available through our website and through Amazon. And also at www.independent.org is a good place to go.
And we have a whole coronavirus issues page. So if you go under issues to coronavirus, a lot of things there. Not that we're the only source, but we have a lot of things, and then we link to other things.
Yeah, we do. We have some good stuff there. We'll remind you of that at the end in a few minutes here. But on what individuals can do, I have another thought myself, which is get information, step one. But also what we are emphasizing here is the importance of what human beings themselves can do and their own decisions when they're not coerced by one another or by the state. And so what that means, if you want to hold on to your liberties that are under threat, you need to do that through proper channels, and you don't want to, like, it doesn't strike a blow for liberty to go out in public and cough in someone's face. You know what I mean?
Well, and it's not civil.
And it's not civil. Yeah, we need courtesy and consideration and so forth, exercise. So being a courteous human being, being careful of those who may be vulnerable without the government forcing you to do it.
Well, we were already doing that before
we were. That's the thing. Exactly.
And our neighborhood had formed a round robin of people were self-quarantining in advance of the shutdowns, the vulnerable populations and so on. Our neighborhood, and I saw many other neighborhoods on Nextdoor, issuing, if I may go out and shop for you, let me know.
Yes,
you have to stay home.
Exactly.
The big sports leagues voluntarily shut down in advance of the orders.
That was not mandated.
At huge costs and other things. So there was a lot of voluntary activity.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, these businesses immediately jumped up before Trump invoked the Defense Emergency Powers Act. Businesses were responding and providing things. So we, free individuals, as you say, can do a lot more.
So in a way, another answer to Solver's query here is that if people collaborating with one another, voluntarily helping, if we are robustly and courteously helping one another, then the public will realize that's happening, and there won't be this great driving need to make the state do something. So for example, very concretely, here in California, Governor Newsom mentioned, I think it was about a week and a half ago, the possibility, or maybe I'd call it the threat, of calling out the California National Guard to distribute groceries. Now, if people are buying and selling groceries and helping neighbors to get groceries, and groceries being distributed freely, the governor won't feel the need to call out the National Guard to distribute groceries, and we'll all be better off. So if we collaborate and are careful and serve one another, just that sense of anxiety about government will be so much less, and our liberties will be much less threatened. Okay, another question here. Well, I think we already know the answer to this one. Skitch, hello Skitch, if you're there. You say, are we not already past the point of no return in terms of government infringement on our liberty?
When people ask me about this, I always pull up the analogy of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
So I don't know how old Skitch is, but I am old enough to have grown up under the Red Scare.
Mm-hmm.
And we all knew, I mean, the narrative was the Soviet Union was huge and powerful, and its people were completely under the boot heel of it. And there was no hope ever
Right.
of the Soviet Union's being defeated. And the best we could hope for was this standoff, the nuclear
And my
standoff.
teachers all said the Soviet Union was the future anyways.
Well, we won't even discuss that point of view. But anyway, I mean, even regardless of your ideology, I mean, it was there. It was
Yes.
it was the
Permanent.
absolute Leviathan and was never going to fall. Well, it wasn't an election. It wasn't a revolution. It was nothing. It was the shift again in the ideology. The people of Poland withdrew their consent. They started believing, hey, we don't have to live like this anymore.
That's right.
Supported by the Pope and Margaret Thatcher and Reagan and others, but it was a shift in that idea that they did not have to live this way. And the Iron Wall fell overnight. The Berlin Wall fell
it crumbled.
peacefully.
It crumbled peacefully.
The Soviet Union was no more.
Right.
And if that was not a permanent, too late state, then certainly where we are is not. And again, the state is just an idea.
Right, exactly.
And undermining it only takes a better idea. And that, again, is why independent is here.
Okay. Is Irizarry Ford, Irizarry Ford ED, if you're there, I think we kind of covered this, but you ask, considering economic health and liberty-centric focuses, which countries navigated this pandemic the best way? And you already said that, but just remind us, which countries did
well?
well?
I don't think I talked about Taiwan, which has probably done the best. So I'd say the top three are Taiwan, South Korea, and in Europe, Germany has the lowest death rate. So one of our colleagues, our CFO, Martin Berger, just returned from Taiwan.
Yeah, he found himself over there in the midst of a crisis.
In the midst of a crisis. And yet, there they are. China thinks they're part of China, but they don't think they are. Everybody's going about their business. There's no lockdowns. Yes, people wear masks on public transport. And then as you're going into a department store, for example, there will be a thermometer, a temperature reader. And if you have a fever, well, I know David and I flew into Hong Kong a few years ago, and there was one there too. You don't pause, you just walk under it. And it sends an alert if you have a fever. He had a sunburn, so we were pulled over, but then, released. And as Martin pointed out, even if you trigger it, they don't arrest you. They just say, you should go home. And sanitizer is widely available and so on, but their economy is open for business. Their people are free. And they've now reporting no new cases. They had a total of under 400 cases in total and a total of 6 deaths. So that's certainly the start. But the common denominator of South Korea, Taiwan, and Germany is all that they declared themselves to be free societies.
And they stuck to it.
And they said, we're a free society. We can't force our citizens to do things. We have to recognize that they have rights. And so they instituted strategies, again, widespread testing of everybody, not if you have symptoms.
And they were able to because they had private companies making the tests, unlike in the US.
And then, so you have targeted responses. So if you test positively, go quarantine yourself.
As opposed to just a blunt instrument of mass.
If you test positively, we'll check with your neighbors and your coworkers and so on. And if they test, and so really constraining the problems to pockets quickly and efficiently, and they're seeing marvelous results. And meanwhile, the rest of us can go about our business. You can build up so-called herd immunity among those of us who aren't. If we're all locked up, we can never come out.
As a group will remain vulnerable. So South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, especially are examples of having much narrower kinds of shutdowns, much more testing, much more information, much more reliance upon voluntary self-quarantine. So that we can learn from them.
Absolutely. And that's what we should be doing.
Code Merchant says, reading a question here, since the federal government seems ill-equipped to administer a lot of things, shouldn't we shift to a system that empowers local, municipal, and state government first? And someone else talks about how JSLRPOD poses the question, shouldn't states coordinate the response to the pandemic? You know, my answer to that is, shouldn't we shift to a system that empowers state and local communities? My answer to that is, that's the system that we have. We should use our system rather than trying to overcome it and nullify it.
This is a city, okay? This is the city's response
Yeah,
to
the
how
city's
to
not
deal
so
with
great.
people.
Mhm.
So yeah, local is better, but best is
Yeah,
letting us work, letting
right. Communities
businesses
and
provide our
families.
needs, and
Mhm,
each of us to provide our own needs. Again, many local rulers are as bad or have
Oh,
as
man.
bad or worse ideas than
But
the national
The
rulers.
good thing about the US federal constitution is that there's all these, the 50 jurisdictions and then sub-jurisdictions under them. There can be, the people there are just as bad as they are elsewhere, but they have much narrower jurisdictions.
Right.
And so we are designed to be a country that has these separated jurisdictions, which have degrees of autonomy and so forth. And that's a good thing.
Right, and especially if you have differing responses, then you can see,
You can see.
well, which
exactly.
response seems to be working. So
I'm fascinated, frankly, by the phenomenon I see right now with the East Coast, Northeast governors and the West Coast governors talking about phasing in their, different reentry programs. I don't think they're getting it right. But what I find especially fascinating is that there is a weird resurgence now among sort of left-leaning parts of the country, politically speaking, to reappreciate the autonomy of the states. I mean, Governor Brown before him and certainly Gavin Newsom are sounding in some ways like the old states' rights advocates. And for good and ill, we may see a resurgence of an appreciation for the role of the states in the federal system. That might end up being one of those other side benefits of the crisis.
well, it would certainly be a good thing to get power out of Washington and bring it back to
Yes.
the local levels.
And it is certainly true that the President of the United States doesn't have all authority.
But best of all would be to return the fact that individuals
Right.
are the holders of rights that are
Right.
inalienable and must not be impinged on by any government power.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question before we try and wrap this up. Literally Montaigne writes in, do you think individual states or even countries could administer a universal health system optimizing the efficacy of decentralism and localism? So this is an interesting question because the writer suggests a universal health system which optimizes decentralization and localism. So in some ways, the question is cutting both ways. I think the answer to this, it depends on what you mean by universal system. Certainly, if by universal system you mean a system where there's a centrally directed mandates for how care shall be provided, how it shall be financed, what shall be covered, what the prices shall be, that kind of universality would put us way deeper in a problem than we currently are.
So this is the subject of one of the episodes of our LoveGov series.
It is indeed.
So season 2, episode maybe 3.
Oh, it's worth watching. It's really
worth
fun.
Watching. It's about, there's a city provided healthcare plan, which the landlord of this house has signed up all of his tenants for. Anyway, LoveGov is a satire. It's on YouTube, LOVEGOV. Recommend you watch it. That episode will answer the question to this. The efficacy of decentralization and localism is best achieved by unleashing local entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
They can be national entrepreneurs as well, but the FDA, again, this is a little bit off topic, but the FDA primarily acts as a protector of big pharma and big biotech against new entrants. And
often in the name of consumer protection.
Right. And that's, again, what happened here. We didn't have masks being produced. We didn't have ventilators being produced. We didn't have sanitizer being produced because the FDA controlled who could produce them, who was allowed to produce them. If you get that out of the way, then local entrepreneurs, as they're doing now, that a gin maker in San Francisco who,
Oh, right. He's
cottage
making hand
gin maker is
sanitizer.
making
Right.
sanitizer and so on. Let local enterprise join in the fray and come up with answers. The more people looking for answers, the better answers we're going to get.
That is for sure.
And the more, again, we're in an era of individualized medicine. The past few years have been marvelous, where we recognize that each individual body is completely unique.
Right.
And we've had medicine come along to meet that on a highly individualized level. And that's what we want. We want individualized medicine. We don't want this centralized one size fits all, because what will work for you. And again, this morning I saw these business leaders are calling on Trump, don't reopen the economy until we have widespread testing, and others are, don't reopen until we have a vaccine. Well, we have a flu vaccine. Every year they guess what that year's flu is going to be, and they make a vaccine. It works for some people, and it makes some people far sicker.
Right.
And it kills some people.
Right. Even the vaccine.
So a vaccine is not the universal answer, and it ought not be considered the prerequisite for our getting our freedoms back.
And with regard to healthcare, just, in sum, one thing I think we have learned from this coronavirus crisis is that the more health is centrally controlled, the more vulnerable we'll be. And so let's go the other direction.
Absolutely.
So, okay. Mary, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. The time has flown. I hope
the time has
people
flown.
Online have enjoyed it. I'm sorry we don't have real-time interaction, but we're glad to get your questions.
Yeah,
and
we're
look
grateful.
forward to possibly doing this again.
Absolutely. And let me just encourage you.
Don't forget the book.
Yeah, don't forget to look at Robert Higgs's book, Crisis in Leviathan, which is available through our website, independent.org, also on Amazon.
And also on ThinkSpot.
Also on ThinkSpot. And the book is available to be annotated on ThinkSpot, which is fun. Some of our colleagues here at the Independent Institute have already put annotations on the ThinkSpot copy of the book. So I encourage you to check that out and check out Robert Higgs's book. He really was prescient, if not prophetic. And also check out our coronavirus information page at independent.org. I encourage you to go there. When you go to independent.org, you will also see our current open letter on AB5, signed by the 150 some California scholars, urging Governor Newsom and the legislature to suspend AB5 as a response to this crisis. So stick with us. Look for the information that will enable you to protect your liberties, keep you from falling prey to some of the mythology of central control, and set us all up for a better future.
And we're delighted to be on ThinkSpot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, ThinkSpot. Okay, take care, everybody. And thanks again, Mary.
Thank you, Graham.